Welcome to today's session on ROPAs. Let me just put the music. Okay, great. So today we're going to be talking about one of the more technical and record keeping sides of data protection law and IT governance, specifically ROPAs. And for this session, you will need to pay a bit more closer attention than usual because it's not strictly speaking legal work, but more administrative and operational. And yes, there are some a lot of technical components to it, but we'll get into that shortly. So to start off, let me just share my screen. Okay, it should pop up now. Okay, great. Let me just stop that and retry again. Okay, great. It should pop up now. I suppose I'm just going to blame the cold in Cape Town for causing weather-related issues and technical difficulties. But anyway, so today we're dealing with a record or creating a record of processing activities. What you'll get from today's session is really understanding what a ROPA is, the context for ROPAs, the applicable law globally and then within South Africa, the rules for controllers versus processors, or in South Africa, are responsible parties versus operators, some exemptions to ROPAs globally, how to get started with ROPA templates, and then the consequences of not completing a ROPA, as well as the ROPA as a living document. So what exactly is a ROPA to get you started off? It is really a record, so something that is documented, and that record consists or lists your processing activities as an organization. And by processing activities within a data protection context, I'm talking about whatever you do with personal information or personal data. Now, the broader context for ROPAs are twofold. So this is generally speaking, yes, there are other specific areas or contexts or viewpoints from which you can look at a ROPA, but from the two main areas are IT governance. And so you need a ROPA to ensure that you can actually govern the information assets within your organization. And I'll pop a link in the chat to an information asset register post that I wrote about. But essentially, it's about having a record of the information assets from a continuity perspective and to know how to actually handle them, and also how to manage your obligations from a company law perspective. Then secondly, and more pertinent to ROPAs where they're expressly mentioned, and that's within a data protection and privacy law context. And to meet the requirements of oversight and accountability under applicable data protection law, you need to be able to demonstrate what you have done with personal information or personal data. And so ROPAs effectively are the means by which you're providing that oversight, visibility, and accountability to meet your data protection, the data protection principles or conditions. And also, when a regulator or supervisory authority comes along, to be able to actually explain to them, okay, this is what I did with the personal data in my organization. ROPA provides a useful tool or mechanism for that purpose. The applicable laws from a data protection and privacy context, well, that's what we'll be focusing on today. We won't go into the company law obligations because that's a separate conversation about IT governance under applicable company law. But we'll be looking at the data protection laws, specifically the GDPR and POP here. ROPAs are dealt with under Article 30 of the GDPR, read with Recital 82. Recitals are basically explanatory notes of the articles and may add more context and subtext. And then with regards to South Africa, POPIA, Section 17, deals with ROPAs, loosely speaking, and refers to PIA, which we'll get into in a bit. But let's start with the GDPR. So under the GDPR, it says each controller, and where applicable, the controller's representative, will maintain a record of processing activities under its responsibilities. So when a controller is responsible for personal data, it needs to maintain a record of those processing activities. And in order, then Recital 82 says, to demonstrate compliance with Article 30, the controller should maintain this record. And the obligation under the GDPR applies to both the controller and the processor in order for them to cooperate with supervisory authorities when they want to know when an incident has happened or they need to do an investigation. So it performs a monitoring function essentially. Under POPIA, POPIA is a bit different in that the responsibility for conducting a ROPA seemingly, or at first glance, seems to only apply to responsible parties. However, if you read Section 17 of POPIA with the obligations on operators under Sections 21, I think it's sections 19 to 21 of POPIA, you will notice that effectively an operator needs to conduct a ROPA as well. But the section in POPIA, section 17, says that a responsible party must maintain documentation of all processing operations. Processing operations is used within a South African context, but ultimately it effectively boils down to activity. And it then refers to section 14 or 51 of PIA, which we'll get into in a bit. But one thing many organizations skip out on it is when mapping the POPIA compliance requirements for ROPAs, they usually only map it to section 17 of POPIA. But in fact, the obligation for ROPAs shouldn't only be seen as specific to that section, because ROPAs form the foundation for accountability, which immediately invokes condition 1 of POPIA, section 8. And then also the relationship between a responsible party and the information regulator, and the responsible party and operators, and the responsible party and their data subjects. Why I say that is to demonstrate to the information regulator that you've complied with applicable data protection law, which may include POPIA, its regulations, and the information regulator's guidance notes. You need to be able to demonstrate your compliance, and the ROPA is a way to do so. So to meet your accountability obligations, you need to have a ROPA. Then also, the ROPA effectively, we're going to get into what a ROPA contains in a bit, but essentially the ROPA forms the foundation for what's actually captured in your privacy notice and ensures that your privacy notice is effectively up to date and aligned with the processing activities you conduct. And so your data subjects know what's happening with their personal data. Now, I should probably clarify the difference between a privacy notice, privacy policy, and data protection policy, because there's much confusion in the community about what it means. But so if we look at the ordinary everyday use of the language for a privacy policy, it effectively is performing the function of a privacy notice. And this is typically in a South African context and the rest of Africa. When we refer to a policy, well, I suppose it would be wise to distinguish between a policy, plan, procedure, and then notice. A notice is simply performing the function of notifying, whereas the policy is setting guidelines and standards that the organization will take to comply with a law or a standard. And so a policy really consists of policy statements, it consists of principles or conditions, and it really looks at the organization specifically. Whereas the notice performs a function of notifying. A data protection policy, on the other hand, is the organization's approach to data protection as a whole, what levels of compliance it's conducting, who's responsible for what, who owns data protection within the organization. And so it's vital to distinguish between those three documents because they ultimately get influenced by this ROPA at the end of the day. Now, theory aside, PIA plays a role in ROPAs as well, particularly section 14 and 51. Sections 14 and 51. Section 14 speaks about the PIA manual, or section 14 of PIA, which needs to indicate what records an organization holds. And so you can see how that ties in with the ROPA, because the ROPA would effectively reflect a inventory of those records. And then also Section 51 of PIA speaks about the availability of the PIA manual, which references those records. And so it's not only that a responsible party must maintain a ROPA, they also need to maintain a PIA manual, and the PIA manual needs to connect with the ROPA. But the focus of the PIA manual is different from the privacy notice in that the PIA manual the focus is on access to information, whereas the privacy notice is about notifying the data subject what is happening with their personal data. Just a quick reminder, feel free to pop your questions or comments in the chat. We'll take them as we go along. Okay, now the approach that I've taken with, that I take with ROPAs and really in complying with data protection laws across the globe and local laws like POPIA, we can rely on international best practices. And in fact, we should. If we look at the founding sections of POPIA, it specifically speaks to international guidance, or relying on international guidance, as well as our constitution in interpreting laws. And so the contents for ROPAs that I'm sharing over here is really based on international best practices and what has effectively worked, which is testable. So the rules for controllers or responsible parties are that for a ROPA needs to be available for each processing activity. I see I wanted to emphasize it, so I mentioned processing activity twice just to give you guys to highlight that point. But controllers, responsible parties need to have a ROPA for each processing activity. And by a ROPA for each processing activity, I don't mean 100 documents dealing with different processing activities. I mean a record that specifies what happens with each processing activities. Visualize an Excel spreadsheet containing columns and rows that specifically set out the processing activity, what happens with the data, who's responsible for it, etc. And for each listed processing activity, that's what you'd need to do. Now, internationally, the ROPAs should best contain the contact details of the controller or responsible party, as well as any applicable joint controllers or co-responsible parties, their representatives, as well as their data protection officer or information officer. You should include the purposes for processing personal data as well, the categories of recipients. So that's where you are doing data sharing, and you would need to indicate who's receiving that data besides yourself. And then the categories of data subjects: are they employees, are they patients? Then categories of personal data: is it ordinary personal information, or is it special personal information? You also need to detail where that data is located and where stored, where it's being transferred to, if it's being transferred, and what transfer mechanism you're relying on to transfer that data across borders. You'd also include a high-level description of the technical and organizational measures. So, the security measures effectively that your organization has adopted to protect the personal data subject to that processing activity. And then, lastly, from a retention perspective, how long you'll keep the data. And that would align with your records retention schedule that's in your PIA manual. Now, the rules for processors and operators are slightly different in that it's more light touch, it's more high level. So although it mentions well, the controllers need to keep a record of everything, a processor is required to keep a ROPA for each controller on behalf of which it processes personal data. And these details would include contact details, such as the contact details of the processor, as well as the controller, the authorized representatives and their DPOs, the categories of processing personal data, transfers, if done so, and whether the transfers are authorized. It would be helpful to list the appropriate data processing agreement here, as well as a description of the processor's technical and organizational measures. So why should you care? Well, because there are consequences for non-compliance, such as fines, reputational damage, and civil action. So you need to make a decision as an organization whether you will, in fact, have a ROPA or not. I recommend that you do, generally speaking, unless you fall into one of the exemptions from a GDPR perspective. So, unfortunately for us in South Africa, POPIA doesn't have any exemptions to ROPAs. However, the GDPR does. So the GDPR says that no ROPA is required if the controller or processor employs less than 250 people. However, there are exceptions to this exemptions. And the exceptions are there's likely to be a risk of harm to the individuals, so the data subjects. The processing is not occasional, so if it happens quite often. And then the processing involves special category data or criminal convictions data. And this is really important because, I mean, if you have a global data protection compliance program in space, although the GDPR, and you may be following the GDPR when it comes to take a global approach to data protection law, there are local laws like POPIA, and then in the EU itself, there are local laws that states have specifically implement that add extra requirements. And so although a company may be GDPR compliant, they may not necessarily be POPIA compliant. And so these distinctions should be noted. Okay, great. Now we're on to formalities for ROPAs. So there aren't specific onerous formalities. They're pretty standard. So ROPAs need to be written and they must be available on request. And that would be by a supervisory authority or regulator. So in the context where it needs to be written, a lot of organizations are taking differing approaches to ROPAs. Organizations with big budgets are using data protection software to effectively manage ROPAs in a way that would be meaningful for the organization. But most organizations, even some enterprises, are actually keeping it basic and using Google Documents or Excel spreadsheets to maintain their ROPAs because it's what's cost effective for them right now. Ultimately, the decision you take needs to take account of your organization, your budget, your compliance needs. I would also suggest that, well, I would say that there are a lot of organizations punting that you need data protection software to perform specific functions. And in an ideal world, yes, everyone would use data protection software, data mapping software, which I'll get into a bit later. But the reality is that's not cost effective for all organizations. And the goal is not to use a specific tool. The goal is to meet the regulatory requirements. And if that needs to be done manually in a spreadsheet, then that's what needs to be done. It's all about meeting your organization's needs and requirements. I've consulted with so many people who have purchased expensive data protection software, and I'm talking about amounts up to 6 million Rand per year that they've spent on an off the shelf solution and not used it at all because of hidden costs. So it's very important to choose what actually works for you and your organization. The next part I want to speak a bit about is the living nature of ROPA, and really, ROPA should really be updated depending on whether there are any changes to your processing activity. So when you start a new one, when you change the activity, or your systems change, or your requirements change, or the processing activity comes to an end, that needs to be documented as well. And so to do this, there are two approaches that you can take. You can either rely on data protection software that will provide you with updates, or you could rely on your internal project management tool to set updates for reviewing ROPAs and make it part of your processes for projects. Alternatively, you can have a defined review policy where you say that we'll review our record of processing activities every 6 months or every year, depending on your organization's requirements. Now, I'd just like to stop sharing my screen quickly and then pull myself fully up on here. So this is a lot of information, and it seems quite hectic, and it often feels as though it feels pretty overwhelming. In speaking to several data protection officers at organizations, the question is where to start. How do I get started with this? This seems like an impossible task to do, but it is not. And the key here is progress, not perfection. And so what I suggest your starting point is, your starting point should be is to get an information asset register in place if you don't already have one. An information asset register would document your processing, document various types of information that your organization owns. I'm actually just going to pop up one on my screen now so that you can have a look at. So if you go to the IT Lawco website and you actually click on Insights, the first post that should pop up is the Information Asset Register. I'll just give you a look at of what it appears like. And so really, it's an inventory that contains specific types of information. And so I've provided you with key details of what the asset register needs to contain, as well as optional data, which would really help in that regard. Then also, so the starting point would be your information asset register. If you don't have an information asset register and you are new to this, what you need to do is something called data discovery, where you need to figure out what data exists within your organization. Now, if you are embedded in a specific company's infrastructure like Microsoft or Google, you could rely on their tools to discover what data exists in your organization, which could be useful, but it's going to be a laborious exercise unless you have specific training in those tools. Instead, what I'd recommend is start broad. Start broad with the main processing activities. Decide what your top 5 processing activities are. Then once you've established that, go broaden, reduce the funnel and go into your individual departments, and then release a simple questionnaire where you ask those departments, well, what are the typical areas of processing that you do, and how does that take place? Let's assume it's an HR department. You would then split your processing activities into recruitment versus employee training, employee wellness, performance reviews, disciplinary action. Each of those could be specific processing activities that you conduct. once you have that information, you you as the champion would bring, or you as a data protection officer would bring in different other people who are in specific departments to complete these sections of the ROPA in a way that is meaningful to you. And there's no reason why you can't, or there isn't any reason why you can't ask your IT team for support, in the sense where they'd create questionnaires or forms that would be able to extract the data provided from that form and populate a spreadsheet with that information. So you need to discover the data, then you need to be able to map it, which is a fancy way of saying you need to record where the data is flowing onto your Europa or your asset register. And the key then is not to overcomplicate it. So, for example, if you, within the HR example, have you focusing on the processing activity of recruitment, and you notice that the types of personal information that you have, or personal data, would be of the contact details of candidates. Now, what I would recommend is that you list contact details specifically on the document, and then link it to a key or a descriptor in another sheet on Excel, where you expand on what potentially could be included in contact details, so that you have a high level overview of what is actually happening, and you're layering the information so that it is easily digestible. Think of it this way: if you want to have a quick look at your ROPA and understand what's happening in your organization, one of your directors want to do so, you'd be able to provide them with business intelligence on what is happening with personal data. But yeah, don't overcomplicate it. Do the best that you can. The key is to start, progress, not perfection, and you should do well at it. If you have any questions, feel free to pop me a mail. It's nathan-ross@itlawco.com, and we can take it from there. Otherwise, there are a range of asset information insights on the IT Lawco website. If you go to itlawco.com/insights, you'll be able to get information about ROPAs, as well as recommendations for templates, etc. Beyond that, it's been great talking to you. Have a lovely rest of your day.